Thank you, Isabella, so much, and thank you also to Pavel for co-sponsoring this lecture. This lecture is initially founded on a simple principle of research, which is the following: that every research becomes a victim, or has the potential to be a victim of its own timing, because we carried out 120 interviews between September 2015 and May 2016 for this Why Mobility project, which I'm going to tell you more about in just a minute. And then, of course, 1 month after we finished the program of interviews, which were scheduled according to the time plan of the whole Why Mobility project, of course, we had this dramatic event in the UK of the referendum of the 23rd of June 2016, which really threw a lot of our results up in the air, because we had been interviewing people about their plans and their experiences, and of course most of the interviewees, like ourselves as researchers and like most of the British politicians and public, actually did not expect the result of the referendum to go the way it did. I mean, even the proponents of the Leave campaign really, in their heart of hearts, probably didn't realize the result would go the way it did. So there is this kind of golden rule of research that as soon as you finish the research, something happens to kind of upset it. But of course, that also offers the opportunity for new challenges. And so what we did, as I'll describe in more detail when I get to that point in my talk, what we did was then to sort of squeeze the budget and try to do some re-interviews. And the major part of this lecture that I'm going to give tonight is about the results of the re-interviews, where we went back to some of the people that we had interviewed before and asked them how Brexit had affected their plans for the future. Okay, so then the title of this lecture is obviously about Brexit and mobility, and the kind of keywords which we play with in this research is connection, disruption, and affect. Okay, affect as opposed to effect. Affect is about kind of psychological sort of impacts and atmospheres, and I'll explore that term in a bit more detail with you a little bit later on. So here's the plan of my lecture. Actually, I have to stand here so I can see the screen in front of me on the computer here. So I'll start off by just sketching very briefly the project, this Horizon 2020 project called Why Mobility, which has just almost literally a few days ago come to an end as far as its funding is concerned. But of course the research that we will be doing in terms of working up results and publishing will probably last for several years to come. It's about new European youth mobilities, and from our perspective in the UK and at the University of Sussex, the role of the UK and London in this kind of new geography of new flows and stocks of young EU migrants. And then, of course, there's the Brexit event, and we actually have just published a paper in Population, Space and Place, which has this title, "And Then Came Brexit." So much of this lecture is based on that article which has just come out. I'll say a few words about our methodology. We interviewed, as you can see, 120 Irish, Italian, Spanish, Latvian, Slovakians and Romanians pre-Brexit, and then we tried to interview approximately a half of them post-Brexit, asking them 6 key questions, which I'll spell out when I come to that part of the talk. I'll say a little bit about, probably too much, because not too much, because it could be too time consuming, but we have a whole bunch of what I think are really interesting theoretical concepts which underpin our work. We play around with the notion of liquid migration. The notion of youth transitions is absolutely intrinsic to the whole project, because the project is about the intersection between mobility on the one hand and youth transitions to adulthood on the other. We'll talk about ruptures, of which, of course, Brexit was itself a rupture, but it also had the effect of personally rupturing some of the lives and plans of the interviewees themselves. We'll talk a bit about tactics of belonging, because this is a notion which echoes through some of the reactions as well. Affect, which I mentioned before, and also privilege. And then after talking about the theoretical notions, the latter part of the lecture, maybe the last sort of 20 or 30 minutes or so, will be devoted to presentations of our main empirical findings, the affect of Brexit, both the effect and the affect of Brexit, and talking also about future plans and uncertainties. So how the young EU migrants we interviewed, how their future plans are affected by this moment of rupture, which happened on the 23rd of June 2016, and whose ultimate effects, of course, are still not particularly clear. Okay, so let's dive into the Why Mobility project itself. It was a 3-year Horizon 2020 project. The name Why Mobility is supposed to be a sort of slightly clever play on words, because it stands for both youth mobility, but also the interrogative question, why mobility? Why do people move? The key words there, I don't need to spell out, you can read them. And the main objectives of the overall project, this is not just at Sussex, but across the whole consortium, and you'll see the members of the consortium in just a minute, is, firstly, a sort of quantitative one of identifying the main patterns and trends of international youth migration in the EU since about 2000, and particularly since 2004, for 3 migrant categories. University students or third-level students, and then higher and lower skilled workers. And we take as our age range, the fairly arbitrary definition of a young person, a young adult person between 18 and 35. Through the qualitative work, we try to understand their motivations for moving, their decision-making strategies, the information sources that they use, and the particular channels and networks that they mobilize to make these migratory moves as well. And then next, another objective is to analyze individuals' outcomes through mobility in terms of education, skills, career building, their general welfare and well-being. We also try to get at their changing sense of identity or belonging through migration, and all this kind of packaged within this broader framework of youth to adult transitions. And then 2 other objectives of the wider project, which I'm not really going to talk about further tonight, but they're there in the project specification. We have a strong sort of territorial element, a strong geographic or spatial element, if you like, in looking at the countries and regions of origin, destination, and return, looking at the economic, demographic, and cultural aspects of that. And then finally, as I guess pretty much all EU research projects have, there's a policy dimension as well. So there's a work package which is devoted to the policy area. So this is the consortium that makes up our group. It's divided into 9 partner countries. 3 countries, these were, as you can imagine, quite strategically chosen. 3 predominantly migrant receiving countries, UK, Germany, and Sweden. 3 predominantly sending countries, Latvia, Slovakia, and Romania. You're probably wondering why Poland is not there. I knew that was the question you were asking yourself. A good question. We had a big debate actually at the beginning of the project as to which countries to choose to invite, and we just felt that there was so much research already on Polish migration that maybe it was not our role to add to it, and so therefore we deliberately focused on countries which are less closely studied from the former sort of Eastern European bloc. And then we looked at 3 countries which have more complex migration dynamics, both sending and receiving, either contemporaneously or switching backwards and forwards from one sort of form of net migration to the other. We had Italy, Spain, and Ireland. And it's really important here that I express huge thanks to my colleagues at Sussex who were involved in the project throughout, Aya Lule and Laura Morozanu. And then a great team of interviewers that we had who are named here, and at least one of which is in the audience. Alexandra, Veronica, Carmen, Katerina, and Alexandra all contributed massively to the project by interviewing quota samples of sort of 15, 20 and more interviewees in their various native languages. So the general context of the wider project is this notion of new European youth mobilities. The idea that in the last, say, 20 or more years, and although statistical evidence for this is patchy and inconsistent, the evidence suggests that there has been a rapid increase in intra-European migration in recent years, particularly of young people, and particularly of young educated people, but not only that. And this slide sets out in very sort of sketchy detail some of the main kind of driving factors behind this growth in intra-European youth mobility. So the role of the single market, obviously the enlargements of 2004 and 2007, which particularly affected flows to the UK, which of course offered immediate access to the labour market, certainly for the 2004 accession countries, not so for the 2007 ones. There was a transition period of 7 years for that, which expired in 2014. And then the rather ambivalent impact of the 2008 economic crisis, which reversed some movements but also accelerated others, depending on the particular impact of the economic crisis on that country and on the sort of twin country to which was linked to different countries by migration. So for countries like Italy and Spain and Greece, and for Ireland, and also for the Baltic countries, particularly for Lithuania and Latvia, there was a renewed migration. I mean, you can, if you like, call them migrations of crisis, which happened after 2008. But in other instances, there was a boost to return migration. So the Irish case is particularly relevant here. There was a big return migration from Ireland to Poland after 2008. And another example there outside of our particular project, but one which I've been looking at in a different context from a country like Greece to Albania, or from Spain to Morocco, and so on. And so looking at the broad spectrum of new European youth mobilities within Europe, we can identify 3, possibly 4 major patterns. So we observe flows between the richer core countries, so let's say between France and Germany and the UK. And if you look at the UK statistics, it's really surprising how large the French and German communities, particularly of young educated people, are in the UK and particularly in London. So we have if we use this core periphery simple model, then there are considerable migrations happening between the core countries. And then the other ones are from peripheries to the core, so from the new so-called Eastern periphery, particularly post-2004, to the core countries, and particularly to the UK and I guess to Germany as the 2 dominant core countries which receive migrants from these source countries. And then post-2008, a new south to north flow within Europe from the southern periphery plus Ireland, plus also the Baltics that I mentioned already. A possible 4th flow would be a flow from the eastern periphery to the southern periphery, because there are substantial migration flows, especially from Poland and even more so from Romania to Italy and Spain. So that's just an overview of the European scenario. If we look within that at a bit more detail at the specific role of the UK, then we see that the UK, alongside Germany, but on the whole ahead of Germany, emerges as the main pole for these new European youth migrations, and especially the economically dominant London region. So that within the UK as a whole, by 2016, by the date of the referendum, there were officially around 3.2 million EU migrants, half of whom came from post-2004 accession countries, and half of whom were from the so-called old EU countries basically of the EU 15 before the first enlargement occurs. And here I think is a really sort of ironic point, given what has happened with Brexit, that in many ways the UK exemplified, maybe better than any other EU country, this kind of ethos of free movement and a kind of neoliberal ideal of, in an unregulated labour market, simply allowing young Europeans to migrate where they can see the best opportunities. And so you got an almost kind of perfect synergy between a flexible labour market, flexible migration, what is sometimes called liquid migration, and a very buoyant economic growth. And one of the messages which unfortunately was not conveyed sufficiently strongly during the Brexit campaign, in fact hardly conveyed at all, was the fiscal contribution that EU migrants made to the UK economy. I mean, a net benefit of 5.5 billion during the decade 2004 to 2014, and other migrants from outside the EU also made considerable contributions to the UK economy. Unfortunately, because of the nervousness surrounding the messages associated with immigration, no political group seemed to be sufficiently confident to push that statistic out there and to imply that immigration was actually a good thing and we should have more of it rather than less of it. And so, drawing particularly on the writings of Adrian Favell, whose writings I very much enjoy, since the 1990s, if not in fact before, London has become a kind of Euro-city par excellence as a result of sort of fitting into this kind of free movement ethos. And Favell calls it Europolis or EU-topia in his wonderful book on Eurostars and Eurocities, a place where young migrants from all over Europe can come to work, study, and enjoy themselves. But we also need to remember, and this is not so evident in Adrian's writings, that migration is very heterogeneous and multi-layered. So we have, the Erasmus generation, of which some of you in the audience have probably been part of. We have our PhDs and our postdocs. We have our city whiz kids on the one hand, and then down through what Conradson and Latham have called middling transnationals, down to the archetypal Polish plumber, cleaners, low-grade service personnel, and so on. So there's a real spectrum of different types of migrant embedded within this overall category of new European youth mobilities. And if Adrian Favell's Eurostars and Eurocities is one book which I think has been very symbolic for the launching of this kind of new European youth migration phenomenon, then another book which takes a rather different perspective is Jane Wills's book, along with several other authors, which is about the ethnic division of labour within London, the book Global City at Work, I think it's called, which shows how many migrants from many parts of the world, including Eastern European countries, are part of this new ethnically migrant-driven division of labour, whereby basically all the horrible jobs which local British people don't want to do get picked up by migrants who are paid appallingly low wages and kept on very insecure contracts. So the methods for the Y Mobility project as a whole, starting with the first round of the interviews, were with these 6 national groups, which were identified at the beginning, and those interviews were carried out according to the time plan of the overall project between September 2015 and May 2016. They covered a wide range of themes that you would expect to be kind of embodied in standard in-depth interviews about people's migration experiences and lives and study and employment histories and so on. So let me not go into that. What is important for this talk, I think, is more what happened after 2016 and the fact that the Brexit referendum came just as we completed the interviews. The date of the referendum was announced back in February 2016. So those interviews that we carried out towards the end of the first wave interviews, those interviewees were aware that the referendum was on the horizon, and we introduced some questions into those interviews. But in most cases, the feeling was, well, you know, Brexit's not going to happen. You know, why would the British population be so stupid as to vote to leave the EU? But in fact, that's precisely what happened. And so therefore, we did feel the need to go back to try to re-interview quota samples of about 8 to 10 of each of the 6 national groups. This proved really difficult to achieve. I mean, some people didn't want to be interviewed again. Some people had already gone back to their home countries, or it was difficult to locate them. And so at that point, we decided to also enlarge the sample to include 15 Poles, and Alexandra Skluderak, hope I've pronounced your name correctly, came to Sussex as a visiting master student, and she carried out the 15 interviews with Poles, which boosted the sample back up to 60. For this lecture, I mainly, however, not entirely, but I mainly focus on 3 groups of interviewee, or three groups of interviewee that we re-interviewed, that have different kind of relationships, different migratory and historical relationships to the UK. So I focus here on the Irish, who of course have a long history of migration and also continued open border with the UK, and that will continue in the future as well. Italians as members of the old EU, the EU 15, and then Romanians as the most recent large-scale group to come in since, I mean, partly since 2017, but also since 2014 when the transition period ended. And we posed basically 6 key questions. There were sub-questions around these six key questions, but the questions were, as you can see there, did you expect the referendum result? What is your immediate reaction to it? What do you think of the new socio-political situation in Britain? Has your sense of home or belonging changed as a result of Brexit? Did Brexit change your plans for the future? For instance, about trying to stay long-term or going back perhaps to your home country, or indeed to moving to another country. And then finally, are you applying for or considering applying for British citizenship, or what was then called the residence card? Okay, this is our kind of toolkit of theoretical ideas, which I guess for the sake of time I will go through fairly quickly, but we were very attracted by the Engberson and Snell idea of liquid migration as applied to intra-EU and particularly post-accession East-West migrations. So we take this idea of kind of open-ended, ongoing, spontaneously generated migration of young adults as being an attractive framework. And in particular, this definitive characteristic of liquid migration, which is intentional unpredictability. Okay. Then, of course, the whole project was built around the notion of youth transitions, to which we also add the notion of ruptures, because these transitions are by no means linear and by no means smooth, even without the event of Brexit. Youth transitions, because of a whole variety of kind of socioeconomic and cultural factors, youth transitions have become less and less linear and less sequential. People have difficulty in building careers nowadays. There's the sort of general prolongation of youth cultures into older ages, into, let's say, early middle age. Some of us still even think that we're still young, even nowadays, many, many decades later. And so you have also sort of reverse transitions and yo-yo transitions where people are moving backwards and forwards between different stages of their lives, like work, for example, and study. So it's not just study into work, it's also work first and then study and then maybe work later on, or maybe work and study carried out alongside of each other. So the whole issue of youth transitions and ruptures and thinking of the process of being young as a process of being and becoming, and then ultimately a process of unbecoming, rather than just something which is defined by a particular age cohort or something which is defined by a simple linear staged transition. And then, particularly in the context of Brexit, this notion of tactics of belonging, which comes from De Certo's work, we find very useful because most of the EU migrants in the UK did not have the right to participate in the referendum, so they were politically voiceless. And yet, in many cases, they wanted to stay. They wanted to have a voice. They were placed in the really unfair position of being faced by a referendum which was partly, if not largely, about them, but they themselves didn't have a voice in the referendum. And then the final conceptual notion is this notion of affect, the way in which there was a kind of affective atmosphere, a resurrection of a kind of feeling of new nationalism, which can be called affective nationalism, which was mobilized around the referendum, the notion that British identity was somehow under threat from Europe on the one hand and immigration on the other. And the way in which, for many of our respondents, as we'll see when I come to some of the interview quotes in a minute, how many of our respondents articulated a kind of affective shock, which was also embodied to some extent. They talked of the referendum as being like, a kick in the stomach or a slap in the face or a kick in the bollocks kind of thing. Some very, very strongly sort of embodied references in that way. So I'm not sure if the highlights is really the right word to use here, but then Brexit arrived as a major national surprise, not just nationally, but all across Europe and perhaps across the world, to the extent that other parts of the world were interested. Although actually Donald Trump referred to his election as his Brexit moment, actually, so there was a parallel reference when he got elected a few months after the Brexit referendum. But what Brexit revealed was a diagnosis of basically a sharply alienated and divided population with a lot of kind of pent-up anger, both with the political class as a whole, but also with the politics of austerity, the fact that, and here again there's a bit of an irony because the main protagonists of the Remain campaign were David Cameron and the then Chancellor George Osborne, who'd been absolutely responsible for the programme of austerity which had economically hit large sections of the British population, the British working and unemployed population, and made their real life conditions worsen as a result. So you had the Remain camp's main message, promoted by those two leading politicians of the time, based on the threat of to the economy of leaving the EU. And some of those threats were not apparent immediately after Brexit, because the economic profile immediately after Brexit was not that dramatic either way. But we are now beginning to see, more than a year later, some of these economic effects taking root. And that was pitched against the message which, of course, won the day, which was the moral panic over immigration, stoked by the three Brexiteers, the charismatic Nigel Farage, I guess equally charismatic Boris Johnson, and the somewhat less charismatic Michael Gove. But between them, they were able to mobilise, supported ruthlessly by the right-wing tabloid media, they were able to mobilise messages about immigration and Europe, but particularly immigration, as messages which emotionally struck home much more clearly with large sections of the UK population than any arguments about economy or security. And of course, at this time, we moved, because parallel discourses were going on in the United States in the lead up to the presidential election then. We were into the era of post-truth politics, of fake news, of the vilification of expert knowledge, and so on. So the slogans that won the day were about taking back control of our sovereignty from the EU, controlling our borders, and particularly controlling our borders at a perceived time of a crisis of immigration, because 2015 and 2016 also saw, of course, the so-called migration and refugee crisis sweep across Europe as well. And this was manipulated in a really cynical way by the far right, and particularly by Nigel Farage of the UK Independence Party. And if there's one kind of symbolic picture which sums up the effectiveness, but also the duplicity of the Leave campaign, then it's this poster here with Farage standing with that typical macho legs apart pose that you often see with right-wing politicians, with his legs apart like that, like a cowboy, standing in front of an image which, of course, was not an image taken of around the borders of the UK. This is an image of refugees, Syrian and refugees queuing up to access the border between Greece and Macedonia. And so my caption to this slide, "It's immigration stupid," is meant to be a kind of cynical parallel to the Bill Clinton phrase when he was seeking election, I think for the second time. "The economy stupid" was what he said. And this is what Cameron and Osborne tried to say. They tried to persuade the British public that the economy would suffer if Brexit happened. Well, actually, it was immigration stupid, which was the message which won the day. So we had this referendum then on the 23rd of June 2016. The referendum question is there. It's interesting to look at who could vote because, as I've already said, EU migrants could not vote except the Irish, who've always historically, since the division of Britain from Ireland nearly 100 years ago, have been able to vote if they're resident in the UK, and also Commonwealth citizens were able to vote as well. So also the Maltese and the Cypriots were able to vote. South Africans, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, large numbers of voters from whole swathes of the world that are still part of this kind of colonial anachronism that we call the British Commonwealth. So from many African countries, from South Asia, and so on. And yet the people who were kind of visibilized by the rhetoric around the referendum, namely the EU migrants themselves, most of them, unless they came from Ireland, Malta and Cyprus, and of course most of them did not, were disenfranchised by the referendum. And the result came out, as you can see it there, 52% in favour of leaving, 48% in favour of remaining. On a 72% turnout, that means that actually only 37%, so a little over a third of the UK population actually voted explicitly to leave. I mean, that's common in many political elections, that actually a minority of the vote ends up with the majority. And then it's interesting, I just do this very briefly, it's interesting to look at the geography and socio-demographics of who voted one way or the other. And the strongest correlations, according to the analyses that have been carried out, are with three variables. With education, the strongest correlation is with possession or not of higher education, correlation coefficient of 0.76, with older age and with poverty deprivation. Those constituencies where people had high levels of poverty and deprivation according to income and housing and unemployment and so on also showed quite a high correlation. And then if we look at the breakdown within the four nations, let's say, of the UK, we find a substantial Leave majority in England, a tiny Leave majority in Wales, a substantial Remain majority, I think 62% in Scotland, and 56% majority Remain in Northern Ireland. So quite sharp geographical contrast, particularly between England and Scotland. That's the biggest contrast there. And at a finer spatial scale, we find that if we just focus on Remain for a moment, they were victorious in the large cosmopolitan multicultural cities, and also most university cities as well, because obviously of the correlation with younger people and with higher education. So there's a whole list of towns and cities there where Remain were in the majority. The Leave campaign was victorious in rural areas, in small market towns, and in the old industrial districts where the effects of austerity were most keenly felt, particularly in the Midlands, the north, and the east of England. And there are a couple of references that you can check out there for that those figures in more detail. So now we come to the second part of my talk, which is about the effect of Brexit. And I just remind you of these 6 post-Brexit questions that we organised the post-referendum re-interviews into. So did you expect the result of the referendum? How do you feel? What do you think now? Has your sense of home or belonging or identity changed? Has Brexit changed your plans for the future? And are you considering applying for British citizenship or the residence card? So for the rest of the talk, I'll just take you through, a kind of very synthetic summary of the responses to each of those 6 questions. So did you expect the result of the referendum to come out the way it did? Most said no, especially those that we interviewed beforehand. Those that we interviewed afterwards, a few said kind of retrospectively that they saw it coming. It's difficult to know whether they were just being wise after the event in order to impress the interviewer. But it could also be that because as EU migrants, and particularly the lower skilled EU migrants, they were perhaps more sensitive to the mood of some British people that they confronted, in their neighbourhoods, in the workplaces, if they were the victims of a kind of pro-Brexit banter or discussion in the workplace or in the neighbourhood, if they sensed that large swathes of the British people were against the idea of EU migration, then it would be those EU migrants themselves who may be picking up that message. So more important was the rest of the question. So question 2 was, what was your immediate reaction? How did you feel when the result was announced? Well, Laura gives us a particularly incisive, brief 2-word answer to that question. But clearly people were shocked, horrified. In the words of Ramona, it totally changed world history, turned it 180 degrees. At work, everybody was crying. This was also the case in my university. When I went into the university the day after the referendum, many people, not just EU migrants, but also, my own British colleagues were also desperately upset and crying as a result. And the feeling was, in the words of Elisa, you don't want us anymore. You think to yourself, what have I done to deserve this? Because she goes on to say, it was not so much a vote on the EU, it was a vote on immigrants. Those two things were conflated, but this immigrant rhetoric was the one that seemed to win the day. Particularly as I didn't mention before, particularly as pushed by the right-wing tabloid media. I think it's true to say that no other country in Europe has the equivalent of our right-wing tabloid media. We have newspapers, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Sun, the like of which probably don't exist in most other countries. And if there's anybody who is singularly responsible for the Brexit referendum, it's probably the editor of the Daily Mail, Paul Dacre. If there's one person who, you could point to and say it was your fault, because day after day, the Daily Mail, which is the largest circulation newspaper in the UK, the Daily Mail was blasting huge headlines which were anti-EU and in particular anti-immigrant. And in terms of interpreting, with question 3, interpreting this new socio-political situation, I mean, some of our interviewees gave us incredibly insightful and quite sophisticated analyses, and my personal favourite is this interview quote from Nils, a young Latvian university student in London, who says, you know, Brexit is about the power politics of some pompous politicians who see populism as the only way to satisfy their hunger for power. Yeah, the name Boris Johnson immediately comes to mind when you read that line. And then he goes on to say the people voting for Brexit should blame the government and not the EU, because it was the government, the British government, that should have provided them with more skills in order to get jobs and do better for themselves as a result of the austerity politics. But instead, he goes on, they blame immigrants and the EU, both of which are actually helping this country. I mean, the fiscal evidence for that was mentioned before. So finally, he concludes that he's worried that the attitudes that prevail regarding the EU can lead Britain down a very sad path where young people like myself will be victims. And then the second quote, which I won't read out, is from one of our Irish interviewees who comments on the rise in hate crime and the way in which xenophobia and talking negatively about migrants has somehow been legitimised by the Brexit result. Question 4 is a more kind of demanding question, and therefore the evidence that I put on the slide here is a bit more complex. So, has your sense of home or belonging changed after Brexit? On the whole, the answers to this question reflect the fact that actually not that much has changed yet, and the situation remains fluid. And here there's a difficulty that we have because, you know, the post-Brexit time period has not been a kind of constant period in terms of how migrants are likely to react to the reality of the referendum result. So the post-Brexit interviews were mainly carried out late 2016 and through 2017 at a time when there was still great uncertainty about what the rights to remain would be. Now the situation is a bit more reassuring. It's by no means sort of fully sorted. But had we been carrying out the interviews in the last few weeks, then we may have got somewhat different results. So again, any interview survey or any other survey of that kind is, even a census, you know, is a kind of victim of its own timing. It's automatically out of date as soon as it's finished. But certainly, the experience of Brexit has made many respondents think more deeply about their own identity, about where they truly belong. They view British politics and British society with a much more cynical eye. They feel in many cases an overall sense of betrayal, that they were kind of encouraged to come to the UK as free-moving EU citizens with full rights to live, work, study, move around, enjoy, you know, all the benefits as EU citizens that they were entitled to at that time. But now, since the referendum, they have been made to feel immigrants, you know, a different category of people. They have been, if you like, visibilized as immigrants because, you know, previously as, you know, white European migrants, they were not really identified as such because they were not physically visible. But the referendum result has made them feel as immigrants. They have been made to feel unwelcome to a certain extent by British society, and so here we begin to see the role of affect as their status becomes visibilized in that way. And we also see, and this came out particularly from the Italian post-Brexit interviews, we see signs of a kind of distinction, an emerging distinction between Italians, let's say in this particular case, as old EU migrants, as migrants from, you know, one of the countries which was the founder of the EU, you know, 20 years or so before Britain joined, in fact, and therefore somehow as first-class migrants, whereas the new immigrants, the new EU immigrants from the post-accession countries are somehow seen as second class and are somehow seen as responsible for the tide of anti-EU immigrant rhetoric, which blew up around Brexit. And so Elisa has this lovely quote here, which I'll read out to you. And she said, "This thing of immigrants, we are Italian and we are a certain kind of immigrant, A-rank immigrants. If you talk to somebody who voted leave, then they're talking about cleaning this country from people you don't want, Romanians, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks and Turks." Now, she said that with a certain note of cynicism in her voice. So this was not what, I mean, this is where the notes that you take when you make an interview are important. So this quote should not be taken absolutely at face value. So she said it with a slight smile on her face, as if she was characterizing or caricaturing a particular view. But we did see this coming up, again, usually expressed in a kind of cynical caricature way from several of the migrant interviewees from the old EU group. So this will be basically Italians and Spanish. Actually, the Irish were much more sympathetic towards the Remain campaign. It was, as I say, the Italians and the Spanish who tended to articulate this notion of distinction between them as old EU migrants and therefore more entitled to stay, and blaming the new EU migrants as being the ones that were largely responsible for the outcome of Brexit. And notice also how Elisa adds Turks on at the end there. And that was simply because in the run-up to Brexit, Nigel Farage, the leader of the UKIP party, kept mentioning Turkey and a threatened invasion of up to 80 million Turks into the UK if we stayed in the EU, because Turkey is an associate member, and therefore maybe at some stage in the future there would be a scenario in which Turkish people would have the right to migrate to the UK. I mean, that's looking very unlikely at the moment in the way that Turkish politics is going, but this was just one of the examples of a kind of, alternative fact or post-truth politics or whatever you want to call it, that resonated amongst certain receivers of these messages. And then question 5, has Brexit changed your plans for the future? And really there are 3 main options here. One is to try to stay on, stressing the right to stay on and this notion of tactics of belonging. Second is to return home, maybe return home quicker than originally planned, if there was a plan to return home in the first place. And the third option is to move on somewhere else. But the main message was a huge amount of uncertainty, because of the uncertainty then, and still to some extent now, over the future status of EU national migrants. So a lot of people were saying, let's wait and see, we'll sort of biding our time and so on. So there's a bunch of quotes here which illustrate, but also maybe challenge a little bit this notion of liquid migration, which I put out there in the brief account of different concepts which were relevant. So let's just quickly go through them one by one. So if we look first of all at Mia's, Mia from Romania. Her quote, so this is a really good example of stressing the right to belong, which we call tactics of belonging. So she says, we all thought that because we work with the right documents, this thing of Brexit won't affect us, because we're not unemployed, we're not living off benefits, we all earn our own money, we pay our taxes, and we think everything should be all right. And this notion of, the right to belong, of not living off benefits, of paying taxes, of not being unemployed, was really a constant refrain which echoed through the majority of the interviews, practically all the interviews, in fact. So that was a very strong message, the right to belong, and the sense of betrayal that was felt as a result of the referendum outcome. And then we have Laura, who gives us a brief comment, which is about what we could call accelerated return. So she probably intended to go back to Italy at some stage in the future, but then she thought, let's finish this PhD as soon as possible, and then let's see. I have a stronger incentive to do it now. After all, it's not that I was necessarily planning to stay forever in the UK. And then Eileen, one of our Irish interviewees, articulates one of two quotes here about moving on. In her case, it's quite a definitive plan because she was literally about to move to Berlin. So she said, I think Brexit is really negative. I am glad that soon I will not live here anymore. My organisation, she worked for a big international charity. My organisation is opening a new headquarters in Berlin. I don't want to live in a country with those kind of sentiments. So this was a definitive plan to move on almost immediately. And then, contrast that with Dorina's brief quote, which is about the possibility of moving on. So this is the open-endedness, which is actually a perfect evocation of liquid migration. So she says, if they kick me out of England, it's not the end of the world. I can go to Spain. And she said with a smile on her face, you know, somewhere sunnier and somewhere warmer. And of course, for Romanians who have migrated in very large numbers to many European countries since 2004, and even more so since 2007. There are, I think, almost 1 million Romanians in Spain and almost 1 million Romanians in Italy. So there are probably family links which make this onward migration relatively possible. So what we see here in terms of the liquid migration metaphor, we see Dorina at the bottom as being a good example of this liquidity of continual open-endedness and moving on. But in the case of Mia, her fellow Romanian at the beginning of this set of quotes, we see really the wish to stay put, and therefore Brexit in some cases encourages people to sort of ground and root themselves in the country because it forces them to try to make that decision. So this is, to some extent, solidifying the migration phenomenon rather than liquefying it. And then the final question was about applying for the residence card or British citizenship. And I think here what's interesting is that you get very different answers, or quite different answers, according to how you ask the question, and also the timing of when you ask that question as well. So Derek McGee and his colleagues at the University of Southampton did an online survey of nearly 900 polls before Brexit, but with the Brexit question included in the questionnaire, in the online questionnaire. And so it was a hypothetical question looking to the future. If Brexit happened, 51% of those Polish respondents said that they would apply for the residence card, and 21% would apply for citizenship. Our own evidence, based on a slightly later timing after the Brexit result itself, and based on qualitative interviews, actually would kind of put question marks against those previous figures. There was, the overwhelming answer was not yes or no, I am or I'm not going to apply for a residence card or citizenship, but it was about let's wait and see what happens. And so there's this indecision, which is very much a reflection on the ongoing debate about the rules for this newly announced settled status card, which was part of Theresa May's more recent pronouncements about what is likely to happen. And then some interviews from 3 Polish and Latvian interviewees, which give different kind of examples of reacting to this question. So Christoph applies for the residence card straight after the referendum and is pleasantly surprised at how quickly it arrived through the post. Liena from Latvia also got the same residence permit straight after Brexit, but she's hesitating about applying for full citizenship, also because it's expensive. It's not only difficult to satisfy the criteria in terms of residence and so on, it also costs the equivalent of about 1,500 euros, 1,500 euros. And then Marek, another Polish interviewee, is almost kind of jumping for joy because he's got the residence card already and he's planning to go for citizenship as well, just for peace of mind. And then the final set of questionnaire, or sorry, the final set of interviewee answers which illustrate even more the prevailing uncertainty, the kind of existential dilemma which has been provoked by Brexit for EU migrants as kind of victims of the referendum, and its ongoing difficulties, legal difficulties, and the so-called effective atmosphere. We have two quotes here. I won't read them out. I'll just leave them with you to kind of read through as I just kind of talk over them. But they're examples of uncertainty and the difficult decision-making process that has to be made. I mean, if I just take you to Monica's quote at the bottom here, it's not just about staying on or moving back to Poland or even moving within the EU. In the case of her case, it's also thinking about moving to Australia or New Zealand or other parts of the world as well. So to try to sum up this, what is still really a moving picture, I mean, the thing that has emerged most concretely in recent weeks is the issue of the Irish border. And actually, rather ironically in the way in which immigration was such a prominent feature of the Brexit debate and the campaign leading up to Brexit. I mean, immigration was the key word which probably swung the day through the moral panic that was created over it. Actually, nowadays, we don't hear very much about this issue of immigration in these post-Brexit wrangles over the customs union, over trade agreement, over the situation of the Irish border, over the issue of the European Court of Justice and human rights and so on. Immigration seems to have faded into the background at the moment, which I think is kind of ironic. But clearly, going back to the points that I put on this concluding slide, I mean, Brexit is indeed a structural event of potentially serious rupture in the lives of EU migrants, in their ongoing connections to the UK, which are thrown into question, and therefore also in the plans that people have for organising their lives through this youth to adult transition, which leads from the late teenage years through the 20s up to the 30s, which is the age by which most of our young interviewees were thinking about, settling down, as I guess most people do around that age, of moving to a stage of sort of more mature adulthood where career and home and partnership and a family become more important. So, as I mentioned also quite early on in this talk, there is, I think, a huge irony in the fact that immigrants from the EU were instrumentalized, manipulated and scapegoated as a major reason for Brexit, and yet they were not allowed to vote, unlike resident Commonwealth migrants. Their vital contribution to the UK economy was not acknowledged, and as I said just now, the whole issue of immigration seems to have faded in recent months. For the EU migrants who are here and want to stay for various very logical reasons, for career, lifestyle, or personal relationship reasons, that's another factor which I've hardly mentioned, but I just want to bring it up now. Of course, many EU migrants who come to the UK form, romantic relationships with, either with local people, local British people, or people of other nationalities, and that means that their wish to stay is very much reinforced, and their deployment of tactics of belonging and narratives of belonging are therefore emphasized in their interview narratives. They are, as I said before, grounding and rooting themselves rather than wanting to continue as kind of open-ended liquid migrants moving backwards and forwards to their home countries or thinking about moving on. For those who fear they may not be able to stay because perhaps they're too recently arrived, they may not have the qualifications to qualify for a residence card or for the new settled status card, the liquidity of their future mobility is illustrated by their being forced to consider return migration or to move on elsewhere. And there were a couple of interview quotes which illustrated that some people are quite relaxed about that, but others actually resent it. And penultimately, many migrants are also aware that the atmosphere within the UK has changed socially and politically, that they are less welcome and somehow more vulnerable than they were before. But as the final previous quote illustrates, which was about, sorry, I've gone back too far. The final previous quote illustrates, I think this one, yes, that's right, the middle of that quote, it talks about Brighton. This was an interviewee who was interviewed in Brighton. And of course, we have to acknowledge that the interviews that we carried out were within the wider London area. So most of the interviews were carried out actually in London, or the majority in London, but a substantial minority were carried out in Brighton. And both of those places were basically Remain voting places. So we need to acknowledge finally that the socio-political effect of Brexit varies from one place to another. We didn't have the resources to do interviews all over the country, but we need to acknowledge that if we had done interviews in other places, in the north of England, for example, then we may have got somewhat different results. And I think that's the last slide. Yeah, a bunch of references, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I'm Dominika Pszczółkowska from CMR here in Warsaw. I'm wondering if among your interviewed migrants, you didn't find any who actually were in favor of Brexit, because especially when you talk about this phenomenon of sort of pulling up the ladder behind you among the Italians, I wonder if perhaps they were pro-Brexit actually.
Paweł Kaczmarczyk, CMR. In fact, I do have two questions. And the first one relates to young migrants and liquid migrants. Liquid migrants, let's call them. If we look at the data on Polish migrants staying abroad, and we have the data since 2010, and this is National Bank of Poland data, we see that there is a clear tendency towards long-term stay or even settlement. So my question is, because apparently most of migrants, if they arrive, they are young, but they age. So the question is about the transition. What are the main important factors responsible for this transition from purely temporary status to more long-term or settlement-oriented? And should it be due to, I don't know, external factors like crisis or Brexit, as you told that, or maybe this is simply because of particular stage of migration process? So it's the first question. And the second is probably more general, because my question is, what should be probably the most important lesson to be taken out of the Brexit story? Because at the end, I think that the link between Brexit and migration could be very weak, in fact. So at the end, we may have United Kingdom out of the EU and quite strong or sustainable migration, so relatively substantial number of migrants stay in the UK. So this is probably what we'll end with. And then you said something about the post-truth politics, and that was quite interesting sentence saying that, in fact, the people are saying what experts really know about the real life. And this is the point, because in fact, I guess what we quite often do, we can make the mistake of aggregation. For example, apparently, this is what you showed to us, that the Leave campaign was the most successful in rural areas and small industrial towns. And I would say that probably these are the areas where the adverse effects of migration are the strongest. So the question is, do you know maybe good studies looking at the linkage between Leave campaign outcomes and outcomes of migration, but on local or regional level?
Okay, actually that was 3 questions, not 2. So can I take that group, because otherwise I shall slightly lose track of what's been asked. So firstly, the question about whether our interviewees voted for Brexit. Well, of course, most of them won't have had the right to vote for Brexit, only if they had British nationality would that be the case, and only a small minority had the right to vote. But your intuition is correct in that we did uncover stories, maybe not necessarily the interviewees that we were confronting, but other people that they knew who did have the right to vote. They voted exactly according to what you have said, that there are enough people from a particular country. I mean, mainly, of course, it was the stigmatization of Eastern Europe here already for us to need any more or to want any more, including people who are from Eastern Europe as well. So it wasn't just Italians and Spanish and Irish. In fact, the Irish were the most sympathetic and most expressed the greatest solidarity with the whole concept and phenomenon of migration. There are no doubt historical colonial reasons for that, because the Irish have a long history of migration and a very ambivalent relationship with Britain as a result of that. But yes, and also other studies have shown that where EU migrants had the right to vote, then they did, a minority did vote for the Leave campaign. An equally interesting question is to look at other migrants, non-EU migrants in the UK. So migrants who are either direct first-generation migrants or parents came from India or the Caribbean or so on, and there, my impression, the referendum was not cross-correlated with ethnic origin or migration history. So this is inferential data which come from constituencies with high levels of, let's say, South Asian or Caribbean or African migrants. And here we see the vote split in two. So there were some areas where multicultural cities with long histories of migration voted predominantly for Remain, but also other instances where existing migrant communities perhaps felt threatened by the scale of recent migration. Again, particularly, I guess, from Poland and Romania, which are the two groups that have most impacted at a quantitative level the increase in migration numbers. So there's evidence there of kind of lack of solidarity between migrants of different migrant waves and different migrant origins. So that's my attempt to answer your first question, the first question. And then to Pavel's question. Your questions are kind of quite closely interlinked with each other, particularly the latter two or three. But the first question was about this, kind of historical law of migration that I think Philip Martin once articulated by saying there's no such, I forget what the phrase now. He has a lovely phrase whereby there's nothing, I've got it, there's nothing more permanent than temporary migration. And of course, we are beginning to see the evidence of that with these latest waves of migration coming in, since the 1990s and 2000s, that initially there was a lot of backwards and forwards mobility, or that's how it was characterized. And partly because of Brexit, perhaps, but also because of the natural, kind of demographic evolution of these migrants from being young to not so young, so moving from their 20s to their 30s. That's precisely, and building their careers. This is particularly the case for, for graduates, for those that are at the higher end of the skilled spectrum that are beginning to build their careers in the UK. They can see that, in order to sustain their careers, they have to probably stay put. Depends a little bit which country they come from. The Slovaks that we interviewed, the highly educated Slovaks, seemed to think they had good possibilities of employment by going back to Slovakia. The Italians didn't have that sense, because to make progress in the Italian labour market, it's really difficult because of the high unemployment, and also because of the fact that you kind of need connections in many cases in order to get a job in Italy, maybe a bit less so in Spain, but the same syndrome probably holds true there. But in, say, Romania, then the prospects for returning home will be much more bleak. So where people were building careers and forming relationships with a partner, potentially a life partner, of course, that's the transition from the 20s to the 30s, from a young to an older young status. So that's exactly part of the youth transition. So I don't think it has so much to do with Brexit or with the particular economic conditions of pre or post-crisis. It's more to do with how people build their lives and make the transition from being a student or being a young worker to being somebody who is of more adult and settled status. And that's a kind of, natural part of the life course. And then you asked, what is the lesson of Brexit? I mean, for me, the biggest lesson of Brexit is not to hold a referendum over an issue like that. I mean, just trust your elected parliamentary representatives, because, if that was the case, then there was a clear majority in Parliament across the parties, across the Conservative Party, across the Lib Dems and across the Labour Party. I mean, both the Conservatives and the Labour Party have been shown to be divided over the issue of Brexit. Maybe only the Lib Dems are uniformly pro-European, but there's only a handful of Liberal Democrat MPs in existence anyway. So the first lesson of Brexit is absolutely not to hold a referendum on something which appears so simple, but which is actually so complex and so open to distortion and persuasion and misinformation. Partly it was that issue of what do the experts know of real life. That was the quote that you quoted back to me, and that quote actually came from Michael Gove, who used to be the Minister of Education. So here was the former Minister of Education saying publicly, the experts, what do they know about real life? We don't trust the experts any longer. So in other words, he was saying, don't trust the economists, because the economists always get it wrong in their economic forecasting. We also see that, of course, resonating across in the United States, debates around Trump's election as well. So there was, unfortunately, this denigration of expert knowledge. And to some extent, I think we as social scientists probably are at fault there, because we failed to put across to the general public, the truth. I mean, even though the truth has been denigrated, nevertheless, there wasn't sufficient effort, I think, from demographers, from migration specialists, from economists, from sociologists, to actually make the case. And, the evidence there that, for example, Christian Dussmann at UCL produced, I mean, it was his work that showed the fiscal benefit of migration over the last 10, 20 years to be massive. It's at aggregate level, yeah, sure. And that brings me to the final part of your question, which is the regional effects. And yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. Yet another of the ironies of Brexit is that the very people many of the very people who voted for Brexit are precisely the people in those areas which will probably suffer most. I mean, these were the people in the areas which received the greatest European structural funds, but, they didn't seem to appreciate that fact. These are people in areas where, industries will be less likely to survive, perhaps in the new, economic reality of the post-Brexit era. I haven't read this set of papers yet, but I saw just a couple of days ago a special issue of a journal. I forget which journal it is, but it's one of the regional economics journals. So it's something like Papers in Regional Science or Journal of Regional Science, a special issue of about 10 papers, all of which look at the ongoing economic data, and which predict exactly what you are suggesting, namely that the areas which voted for Brexit will be the ones precisely that will suffer the most from the effects of the detachment of the UK from Europe.
Yeah, interesting thing about this referendum was about the Nice referendum in Ireland. You remember first time it was refused, which meant that Irish said no to the enlargement to this part of Europe. And then international community put pressure on them. Why you decide about the lives of hundreds of millions of people? It's unfair. Please perform one more referendum. While in the case of Brexit, that there was no such a pressure from the side on the international community. Maybe you British people were wrong, think twice, let's organize the second referendum. It was the strong, yeah, we need to execute the outcomes of the referendum and to bring exit from the European Union. Why you think there was no this kind of pressure from the international community? Or because you are a bigger island, less be able to put under the pressure? It's a provocative question.
It's not. I don't. It's not really for me to say that. I mean, I don't know why there hasn't been that pressure. I mean, I can justify why there hasn't been a pressure from within the UK political system or popular voice to convincingly argue for a second referendum. I mean, there are people who are beginning to say that. I mean, there were people that began to say that more or less from the beginning. But you put your finger on an issue which I hadn't thought of before. I mean, I knew that in Ireland there was a second referendum. I didn't realise that that second referendum was the result largely of external pressure. And it's a pity that that external pressure perhaps is not levied on the UK, except that in the UK that will be interpreted as that will be resisted, and the argument will be turned around, because it falls a little bit into the general field of sort of expert knowledge, because we had all sorts of people came out. I mean, President Obama made a very explicit statement, but that was used to disadvantage by saying, well, it's these people from outside that we don't want interfering. We want to reassert our own national identity and our own national right to self-determination. So if there was that pressure that came from outside, I think it will be turned around by the pro-Brexit campaign as reinforcing even more the right of the British people to ignore, what comes from Europe or what comes from elsewhere, and to have the right, just ourselves to, so we've had these constant mantras, that Brexit means Brexit, and that people who want to try to rerun the referendum are called not Remainers but Remoaners, because they're moaning about the result and they can't digest it. And I mean, it's okay. We're getting into the realm of British politics here, which maybe is not a good kind of avenue to go down. But I mean, the people who are arguing for a second referendum are Tony Blair, Nick Clegg, and some of the old sort of Tory, so-called Tory grandees like Michael Heseltine and Ken Clarke. The problem with this unlikely alliance of people is that they come from different parts of the political spectrum, so they're unlikely to be strong enough or to cohesive enough to form a proper, effective, progressive alliance. And of course, the problem with Tony Blair is ever since Iraq, his credibility is always going to be questioned. And the problem with Nick Clegg, who's the leader of the Lib Dems and who was in coalition with Cameron in the first Conservative Lib Dem government. The problem with Nick Clegg was that many of his election promises were shown to be undeliverable. So he promised, for example, not to raise student fees, and of course they shot up, and he was unable to stop that. So both Clegg and Tony Blair, and also John Major, who made a wonderful speech 2 weeks ago in favour of, again, rerunning the referendum, or the possibility of rerunning the referendum. All those people, have a kind of negative image as well, or a negative image which can be resurrected and turn against them. So, don't trust what Tony Blair says, because look what happened with Iraq. Don't trust what Nick Clegg says, because look what happened over his duplicity over university fees. How can you trust John Major because, he's a voice from the past and just wants to have his voice heard again? How can you trust Michael Heseltine, who, is kind of, 85 years old and again is a political figure of the past and so on. So there just isn't the sufficient groundswell to really make that case for a referendum. I think the only way in which a rerun of a referendum will be if there's some kind of, complete disaster in the ongoing negotiations. Yeah, of course. Sorry, I've been talking too long. Yeah.
My name is Kamila Fiałkowska. I'm a member of the CMR, but also a former Sussex student. And my question kind of builds on Dominika's question about whether the EU migrants supported Brexit. And because I did my fieldwork right after the results were out in summer of 2016, and surprisingly, a lot of my respondents they were actually in favor of Brexit. And what this made me think, because you mentioned that one of the explanations could be that the established migrant communities were kind of fearing the new cohorts of migrants, so therefore they would rather protect themselves against the newcomers. And I had a feeling that it also it's quite important to look what are the attitudes towards the EU among the new EU migrants, and especially, for example, in Poland, there's a lot of Euroscepticism, and this resonates in the migrants' narratives about their life in the UK. They felt that they have been somehow abandoned by the home country in the past, while nowadays, there's this support among the Polish migrants in the UK towards what is happening now in Poland, towards the right-wing government. The elections in 2015 also showed that. So I think this is kind of important thing to look at in trying to explain why some EU migrants are actually pro-Brexit. And one more thing, because it made me think also about these distinctions that people make. You mentioned Elisa, who did this distinction between this, A-class and B-class migrants, and many Poles that I've been talking to, they were also making these distinctions. It's us, white, European, Christian, whatever, versus them. And them, not surprisingly, are the Muslims, the people of color. And this distinction was very, very vivid, and that's how they also kind of build their belonging. That's my intuition. So I wonder what would you say about it? And also, whether the cohort of migrants or sample of migrants that you interviewed did represent this heterogeneity of the EU migrants? So can you tell us more about the socio-economic backgrounds of your respondents? Thank you.
Okay, there's quite a bunch of interesting remarks there. The interviewees that you talked to and who expressed this pro-Brexit view, did they already have the right, did they feel that they already had the right to stay in the UK? Because I can see that if you already have citizenship or you already have a residence card, then it's easier for you to say, okay, we're here, we have the right to stay.
Most of them didn't have the residence, like long-term residence or citizenships. One of them had the citizenship already. And the most of them, they said that, the British public were tricked into believing that these are the EU bad migrants, but these are the other migrants which are bad. And eventually they will come to their senses, realizing that all Poles are gone. This kind of narrative. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
What you say does actually resonate with some work. I have a few PhD students who I'm supervising at a distance around different parts of Europe, and I have one called Jelena, who's in the University of Prague, who's been working on Czech migrants in the UK, and we've been just emailing recently, and she says pretty much exactly the same as you, that she was surprised that many of her interviewees who she interviewed mainly before Brexit, but then she's been emailing and Skyping with them afterwards as well, and she said that, well, actually, I'm quite surprised how many of my interviewees, were kind of in favour of this trend. I don't know whether it's because of Euroscepticism or whether it was an expression of, I suppose, racism against other migrants of colour. Maybe there was a bit of both going on there. And yeah, it is an unfortunate fact that many migrants from mainland Europe, and particularly from the sort of Eastern countries that don't have their own experience of immigration. So also from Latvia. I've also interviewed a lot of Albanian migrants in the UK, which is on a separate project. And, I'm surprised and actually rather shocked at how racist they are. But I mean, partly this is a racism of ignorance, I suppose, that they haven't really had the opportunity to encounter any kind of a multicultural society in their own countries. And so they're really kind of taken aback by the situation in this country. And they're particularly taken aback, if they have to work in a working environment where their boss, is a black guy or an Indian woman or whatever. That's something that they have difficulty in kind of digesting. But yeah, your final remark was about the heterogeneity of our sample. And we tried to, across all of the 6 national groups, we tried to stratify the sample in 3 more or less equal groups: university students, people with university qualifications who were in the labour market but not necessarily doing work that reflected their university qualifications. It depended, a little bit on where they did their university qualification, how good their English was, and so on. And then people without third level of education who were mainly working as unskilled or semi-skilled workers. When it came to the re-interviews after Brexit, we found it almost impossible to re-interview the third of those categories. They just seemed to disappear, or they felt that they didn't want to be re-interviewed. I guess they felt that they'd told us enough already and they didn't want to go through the whole process again. So nearly all of the re-interviews were with the higher skill groups. So these were more educated, obviously more articulate, and therefore more likely not to express a pro-Brexit view. I suspect the pro-Brexit view comes more from the less educated of these different nationalities of migrants.
Hello, my name is Zana Sirkovic, and I'm an international relations student here in Warsaw. I'm writing a thesis on Brexit, so my question concerns not really immigration, but the Brexit itself. So you mentioned that there was a bunch of articles on Daily Mail and some other issues, I bet, as well, about focused on how EU is bad and kind of showing it in a bad way. So do you think it was kind of a failure of EU in its turn to promote itself in Britain?
Yes, I mean, that kind of resonates with the question that Isabella raised about pressure from outside. And I mean, I guess in the lead up to the referendum, most people thought the referendum would go the other way, and therefore, the strong promotion of pro-EU views was probably not thought of as being so necessary, because also the poll predictions, predicted a Remain victory. As the referendum date approached, the margin of that victory in the prediction of the polls progressively got narrower and narrower. And then obviously, at the last analysis, it was within the margin of error, and that's why it went the way it did. But then, of course, we saw the same thing with the presidential election in the United States as well, which again confounded the polls. So it seems to be a new trend that the polls have difficulty in getting it right. When the campaign is more on the right wing side of the political spectrum. So that, I guess, that tells you that a lot of people vote in a particular way, but they hide that from the polls. They say one thing to the polls, but then actually they vote in a different way.
I just have a very brief one, Paula Postulka from SWPS University. So from those 60 interviews, I think you alluded to this a little bit, but I was wondering if there are differences between men and women, because you talked about this is a life stage when they start settling down and starting families. But if we, think about global statistics, then we know that the marriage market is very much, structured in a very ethnicized and gendered way. So when we talked about mixed marriages of Poles, we basically talk about Polish women who marry Western men, and that's also been proven in the case of Slovaks and Czechs and so on. So are there any different strategizing, and maybe, one gender is leading to leaning more to one option about the post-Brexit reality.
Yeah, I mean, gender is always a relevant and interesting question to raise in any kind of research of this nature. I mean, the first thing that we found was that it was much easier to, women were much more responsive to being interviewed in the first place and then to be re-interviewed in the second place, and that seems to be a general rule. I mean, we were talking a little bit about this earlier this afternoon. Second thing is that when people first migrated, it was quite often the case that young women were following their boyfriends. It was almost never the boyfriends following the women. I mean, I find that rather sad, but I guess that's reality, that, you know, it works that way round. With regard to future plans, I think it's a little bit less clear. I'm not sure that we have sufficiently robust data across the two genders to really, for me to sort of pronounce an answer to that question. I have the sense that probably men are a bit more return migrant orientated than women. I mean, this might have partly to do with the pattern of partnership and intermarriage that you mentioned, that it's mainly women who marry local native sort of resident men rather than the other way around. But I mean, I think other studies of return migration generally tell us that men are generally keener to return migrate, because that by doing so they can kind of reclaim their status in the home society. Whereas if women return migrate, they might be returning to a more sort of subservient social position from which they have escaped through migration. I mean, a lot depends on the jobs they do and all sorts of other things, but insofar as one can generalize, then that's, I think, a fair generalization.
Russell, your talk has brought very vibrant and engaging discussions. I think that we still have some questions to ask over coffee and canapes and little things to eat and chat in it. So thank you again for coming to Warsaw. Although the winter is back, the beast from the east arrived again. We had a wonderful visit today to Poland Museum, also learning about the current context of Poland. So we had discussions and the meeting with the director of Poland Museum. So I think altogether it was tiresome day for you, but interesting with all the discussions we had in this university and beyond. So thank you again, Russell, for coming.